There are reasons to be more worried about young people because they're people who haven't yet got lots of experience. They're coming to the labour market for the first time. They might be getting entry jobs where they're still cutting their teeth. If you are going to pay an 18-year-old and a 25-year-old the same wage, then most people will prefer a 25-year-old potentially because they've already got some experience. Hello and welcome to the IFS Zooms In. I'm Helen Miller, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. In 1999, the Labour government introduced the national minimum wage. That has arguably been one of the biggest economic policies in recent decades. It was initially introduced at the rate of £3.60, which, if it had been uprated in line with prices, would today be around £6.90. Instead, it has risen more quickly than prices to a level that's over £12 for adults. That leaves the UK with one of the highest minimum wages in the world. So today we're going to take a deep look at this policy and the effects it has. In particular, we'll look at what is and isn't known about the effects the policy has had on employment and on various Ps, so prices, profits, pay and productivity. We'll also take a look ahead at what to expect, where this government is trying to increase or planning to increase minimum wages for young adults. To do that, I'm very delighted to be joined by my colleague, Eduin Latimer, who is a senior research economist here at the IFS and who previously worked at the Low Pay Commission on minimum wages, and by Alan Manning, who is Professor of Economics at the London School of Economics, a former chair of the Migration Advisory Committee, and has written extensively on minimum wages for a long time. So thank you to both of you. Eduin, let's start where I always like to start, with just the kind of basics of what we're talking about. So kind of fill us in on what is the minimum wage and what's happened since it was introduced back in 1999.
So the UK has a minimum wage, which sets a minimum on how much people can be paid per hour. We often refer to it as a minimum wage, but actually the UK has 4 different minimum wages. So one for adults over 21, and then some youth rates for 18 to 20s and 16 to 17-year-olds, and actually a separate one for first-year apprentices. Looking at that adult rate, what's happened since it was introduced in 1999 is it grew gradually from 1999 to around 2015. It was introduced by a Labour government, and under both the Labour government and the coalition government increased gradually. And then since 2015, there's been this policy introduced by the Conservative government, which is called the National Living Wage, which is to try and increase the minimum wage to hit certain targets as a share of median pay. So first 60% by 2020, and then 2/3 by 2024. And those targets have led to rapid increases in the minimum wage over that period. And as you said in the introduction, has put us towards the top of the international league table for minimum wages relative to median pay.
So am I right in saying that, in the most recent years, it's only countries like New Zealand and France that have higher minimum wages?
Of similar developed countries, relative to median pay. So obviously this is relative to the kind of typical pay in the economy.
So broadly speaking, we had this minimum wage introduced in 1999. It did rise across the years. Actually, it still rose faster than prices up to 2015, but then it kind of rose even faster into recent years. We're going to talk about what effects it had, but I first want to sort of pan out about why we have one in the first place. I mean, Alan, you've been studying these things for a long time now. It won't entirely be obvious to everybody why we have the government intervening in the labour market and setting these pay floors effectively. I mean, why do you think we have a minimum wage?
I mean, I think there are 2 broad reasons. The first is around sort of inequality, that the minimum wage helps people who are low paid by the hour. That isn't necessarily translate into being in households with low total income, but on average, they're towards the bottom end of the income distribution. And so it's one tool that we use to try and reduce inequality in our society. The second argument is more around people who think that the labour market, left to its own devices, there's an imbalance of power between workers and employers. And employers would naturally have too much power over workers. And so we're trying to intervene to redress that imbalance of power. And that would be both good on reducing inequality grounds, but actually would also be good on increasing the efficiency of the economy, because otherwise we would end up with sort of too many low wage, low productivity employers in our labour market.
And do you have a sense of kind of how much of our minimum wage we can justify through that second channel, that kind of efficiency channel we need to try and correct a failure in the market? So to what extent are we doing that versus have we gone much further than that for this redistributional channel you're talking about?
I mean, that's the big question, really, because even amongst those people, I'm one of those people who thinks that we want to have a minimum wage over some range, redresses this imbalance in power, doesn't necessarily cost jobs. We think, well, there comes a point at which it's gone too far, in which it would be pricing workers out of jobs. But there's a huge amount of uncertainty about exactly where that is. And I think what we've been learning really is that, as far as we can tell, you can push the minimum wage up really quite high, probably higher than, if you had asked me that 20 years ago, without any very obvious job losses coming. But at the same time, there's this feeling, sort of nagging feeling in the back of the mind, there must come a point where it's gone too far. Will we be able to know when we've reached that point? Will we be able to not push it too far?
So I want to come back to the employment effects. I think you're right. That's the big debate in some sense. And lots of people have been surprised that it's kept going up and we haven't hit this big fall in jobs yet. But just on this redistribution point, Edwin, I mean, a lot of people will think that the government does most of its redistribution through tax and benefits, and it does a lot of redistribution through tax and benefits. So maybe just let's talk a bit about how tax and benefits versus minimum wages, and alluded to this a bit, will affect different types of people and will have different effects on distribution.
As Alan said, the one case for the minimum wage is redistribution, and that's because it increases pay for low-paid workers, and they tend to be in low-income households or in the bottom half of the income distribution. They don't actually tend to be right at the bottom of the income distribution because typically people right at the bottom of the income distribution, nobody is working in the household and they're typically mostly relying on means-tested benefits. So they're not right at the bottom, and actually some of them are surprisingly far up if you're a secondary earner. So you might be one person in the household is on a minimum wage job, but somebody else in that household isn't actually on quite a well-paid job. So they are spread throughout the distribution, but on average, they're towards the lower half, if not right at the bottom. So the case is, these are the people who are going to gain from the minimum wage, and we can redistribute through the minimum wage. And one advantage of doing that instead of, or as a complement to tax and benefits, is that might not affect their work incentives in the same way as, say, increasing tax rates and increasing the rates of means-tested benefits.
And then, Alan, I'm interested in, you've sort of seen the minimum wage kind of come and increase. I mean, are you surprised at the extent to which policymakers have increased the minimum wage really quite quickly relative to prices? It's now a much bigger policy than it was when it was introduced.
A little bit surprised. I don't think if you'd asked me 20 years ago, I'd think we would be where we are today, especially because for much of that period, these increases were introduced by a Conservative government. The Conservative Party actually fought the introduction of the minimum wage when it was first introduced. I think for a number of years actually campaigned on abolishing it if they came into power. So, there's something of a surprising turn there, change in their attitude towards it.
Because now it definitely seems like it's an accepted part of I don't think anyone's talking about abolishing the minimum wage. We might be having debates about how high it should be or who it should apply to, how the different rates are, but I don't think you see the debates now about whether we should have one or not. It's really debate about the level.
Yeah, and part of that is in the UK, it's sat through this low pay commission, or who recommend it. So there's, as Alan said, Conservatives set their target for it, but the actual people who are recommending it are the low pay commission. And this is a tripartite organisation with experts on it, union representatives, and so employee representatives and employer representatives. And I think that's helped to build consensus and ground the conversation in evidence. So employers who might historically be opposed to it are involved in the process and are listening to the evidence. And I think it's one reason why we have quite different debates about the minimum wage here than, say, in America.
So let's talk about some of that evidence. So, Edwin, you and I were chatting before we recorded this, and you told me about the P's in this situation. So there are prices and profits and pay and productivity. So why don't we sort of work through a little bit of those, what we know and what we don't know, which is always important about these things. Let's start with pay, because that's the thing that's directly affected. You put a wage floor in, people's pay is affected. What's happened to people's pay?
Unsurprisingly, it's pushed people's pay up, and it pushes both minimum wage workers' pay up and pay up for people who are paid slightly above the minimum wage. And that means it's actually quite like a bigger deal than you might think on the face of it. So about 6% of workers are paid the minimum wage. And that's actually not changed very much since 2015 when we've had this big increase in the minimum wage. But there are quite a lot of people who are paid near the minimum wage. So about 1 in 5 workers are paid within £1 of the minimum wage. And what happens is when the minimum wage goes up, their employers think, okay, well, we've had to, the wages right at the bottom have gone up. I want to keep a certain differential over that minimum. And so I'm going to raise the pay for these workers as well. And so actually that means that this is becoming an increasingly important part of wage setting in the UK.
But I think that's really surprising. I think that number's worth underlining. I mean, that's 20% of people, so 1 in 5, being paid within £1 of the minimum wage. That's a lot of people. I mean,
yeah, 20% of employees.
Okay, that's a lot of employees.
Yeah, yes, no, exactly. And it also, they're slightly more widely spread than just the minimum wage workers. So minimum wage workers tend to work in the private sector, tend to work in sectors like cleaning, hospitality, retail. Whereas when we look at this broader group of people who are affected by the minimum wage, lots of them are in those similar sectors, but you start getting into quite a lot of public sector roles and just lower level administrative roles across more sectors across the economy. So it really is starting to affect the whole economy.
So you've talked about the kind of direct effects on people who are being subject to the minimum wage. But it also is creating some compression in the pay distribution. So people are getting closer together in how much they're paid. So managers might now be getting paid more similarly to people who are managing.
Yeah, so we have pretty good evidence that it is doing this compression of differentials because the minimum wage increases pay for people right at the bottom, and then it has some effects further up, but the effects aren't big enough that they're still smaller, so you end up with this compression. So we definitely know that's happening. That's happening both within firms and across firms. What I think we don't know, and I think this is a reasonable concern here, is this might affect your incentives to get a promotion, to develop new skills. What I think there's an area where we could get much better evidence is about does that compression actually have that effect, or are people still going for the promotion even though it doesn't pay as much?
How much would you worry about that, Alan? Because it doesn't feel very motivating if you do some training, you get a promotion, but actually you're only paid a few pennies more than the person that you were.
I'm not sure I necessarily worry about it so much. I mean, I think, people still would like the career progression and so on. But I think Edwin is right that we don't know really very much about it.
Okay, so pay is affecting lots of people now. Alan, you already mentioned earlier the kind of impacts on employment. Everyone's always worried that minimum wages are going to affect jobs. There'll be fewer jobs, which intuitively makes sense. You make jobs more expensive, you get fewer of them. We haven't seen that. So maybe tell us about the evidence and why it's not so surprising that we didn't see more job loss.
Yes. So the evidence tries to look at, we have, changes in the minimum wage, and then we try and look and see what happens to employment, trying to control for all the other things that might affect employment at the time. I mean, and that exercise is sort of easier in some contexts than others. So it's not so easy actually in the UK because we have a national minimum wage. It's much easier, say, in the US, where the states set their own individual minimum wages often, and they don't change the minimum wage for years and years and years, and then they change it by some huge amount from one day to the next. But the studies that we have generally find employment effects to be very, very small. And some people in the past have said, well, this amounts to saying, well, trying to repeal the law of gravity. And I think that's sort of wrong, because I think people are thinking about employment as being very demand determined, by the employer driven. But yes, it's true that if a worker is to be in a job, the employer has got to want to employ them, but it's also got to be that the worker wants the job. And so labour supply is as important as well. And when you're pushing wages up, as the minimum wage does, you're making work more attractive for workers. So I see it really as a balance between these demand and supply factors, and which in practice turns out to be stronger, rather than perhaps a more conventional view, which sees it's only labour demand that matters.
But I mean, in some ways, it must be true that is it true? It must be true at a certain point you would get employment effects. I mean, so how do we know how close we are to the point where if we keep pushing it up, you're going to see bigger and bigger effects? I mean, do you have much evidence on that?
So I would say we've got fairly good evidence up to the point we got to just before the pandemic. So there was a good study done by some IFS colleagues which found that limited employment effects over that period. And that's also in line with quite a lot of the studies in the US are at similar rates of the minimum wage and found limited effects. So I think we're fairly confident that's not too far. I think we've then gone into a more challenging period where we've continued to increase it from 2020 until now, because it's just been a hard time to evaluate policies. There's famously issues with the UK's labour market data at the moment. And it's also a big global pandemic happening at the same time, which has made it hard to know exactly what the effects of the most recent changes in the minimum wage are. And it's also worth noting we're kind of, as we said at the beginning, moving towards the international frontier. So this is where there's kind of less evidence. Having said that, the kind of efforts that the Low Pay Commission and others have made to try and evaluate the more recent changes don't seem to show big effects. So there's probably more uncertainty around that than there were pre-COVID. But we're probably still not, it doesn't look like we've fallen off a cliff.
This is often true with evidence. Even if in the best will in the world you want evidence, sometimes the evidence just not there. If you're policymakers now thinking about whether to push it out further or what to do in the future, to what extent do you think actually would be like take confidence from the fact that it hasn't had effect on jobs yet, or be a bit more cautious because we are at this frontier, we don't really know, and we are getting to the point where we are pushing the boundary? I mean, do you have a view, Alan, on where would you put the balance of uncertainty?
I would begin to be sort of a little bit apprehensive about big pushes further. But I think people sometimes sort of exaggerate, what the consequences of going too far would be. I mean, I think really we're talking about trying to find, the summit of a sort of quite gently sloped hill, really. So, if you go a little bit down from the summit, but go a little bit too far, the correction isn't really that difficult. You just don't increase the minimum wage by very much or at all for a number of years. And we have general inflation and so on, and then the real value goes back. So I don't think, the risks of pushing on are massive because you can backtrack. And sometimes I think you have to make the evidence. There's the mantra of, evidence-based policy making, and that's all very good, but you have to have the evidence base to do it. And where does the evidence base come from sometimes? Well, sometimes it has to come from policies which to some extent are a leap in the dark.
Yeah, okay, so maybe cautiously going ahead, but remembering that we shouldn't be expecting one day you fall off a cliff and the job market crashes and there are no jobs left. It's maybe you start to see some effects you don't like and you can row back.
Yeah, and I think we're going to come on to it, but there are other trade-offs here rather than just like, are there employment facts or aren't there employment facts? And I think one challenge with this debate is it basically often boils down to that, where actually there's probably more trade-offs. There's trade-offs about how it's changing the structure of the pay distribution, how that affects challenges of recruitment and retention in the public sector. And then there's challenges around how it affects prices, profits, etc.
The other Ps.
And the government should really be thinking about all of those trade-offs altogether rather than just thinking we're either going to fall off this employment cliff or we're not.
So tell us about the Ps.
Okay.
Pick a P and tell us about a P.
So I think let's link this back to the conversation about redistribution. So we said it's going to benefit low-paid workers who typically are at bottom half of the distribution. The kind of other half of that is who is it going to take? Who's going to pay for that transfer? And in the first instance, that's coming from the firm, but that's not necessarily the final impact. And so one option, and actually the one where there's probably the most evidence, is prices. So firms see a raise in the minimum wage, and one way they finance it is by increasing prices. And especially minimum wage sector in the UK, lots of the workers are in non-tradable sectors, so things like hospitality and retail, where everybody across the whole sector is being affected by this minimum wage rise. And so they all increase prices, pass some of it onto the consumer, and probably people still go to the pubs and bear those price rises. So that's one way that firms definitely deal with this, is they pass some of it onto prices.
So prices is one effect, and you said there's better evidence there. Of course, profits are going to be related to that because, in some sense, like you said, if it's passed on, if it's not in employment and it's not in prices, then it could be in profits. So firms could just be, if firms have profits to start with, they can end up with fewer profits. But it's about productivity too, Alan, because I think there are some schools of thought that basically go down the idea that you could get firms to invest in more capital and to put alongside workers. And this could be a good thing for productivity if we just have a higher skilled, higher value economy. So what's your take on the role of productivity in all of this?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that is one area where we have some evidence, but I think it would be fair to say we could do with more. So there are some interesting studies which suggest that actually the minimum wage may in part pay for itself by increasing productivity. There are a number of ways in which that might happen. First, it might be, just running firms consumes time and energy of managers. Director of IFS, you probably empathise with that. And, you have to decide what to focus on. And so when the minimum wage goes up, that forces you to focus on how you use labour effectively and productively. So that might be one mechanism. It might be the employers intensify work, but that might not always be a plus for the workers because they're now getting more money, but their work is more stressful and so on. There might be also what has been called the sort of reallocation effect, that the minimum wage puts pressure on what in our economy is quite a long tail of low productivity firms. And, they survive by sort of paying workers less than they should, really. And when we raise the minimum wage, some of those firms go out of business, but their workers don't go to unemployment. They're reallocated to more productive firms. And there's some evidence from Germany. I think IFS had some work on that could be important as well.
Okay, so affects prices, might affect profits, might affect productivity.
Yeah. I guess the balance between those three things is pretty important for what we think of the policy. So if it's coming through profits, then typically the shareholders who are going to be paying for those profits towards the top of the income distribution, might help the case in terms of redistribution. If it's prices, then that's consumers who are spread more evenly across the income distribution. We might still think this is good for redistribution. And then finally, the best case scenario would be if we are seeing those productivity impacts, which I think are unlikely to be across the whole economy, but might be happening in some places. And in that case, this is less of a zero-sum game and it's actually beneficial for everyone. Yeah.
Well, we still have a pretty long tail of low productivity firms, so it hasn't solved that problem, even if it's helped. I want to come on to talk about kind of what might happen going forward. But first, I want to pick up on employment rights and other policies that are happening in this space, Alan. So the government, we've had the minimum wage, it's been increased over time, and that might have changed the balance of powers between employees and employers. But this government has also recently is changing employment rights. So, how would you expect those two things to interact?
So I think that there's sort of two views here. So the negative view would be the government has pushed up the minimum wage, that's pushed up labour costs, that's bad for employers. Maybe bad for employment. And now on top of that, they've piled these extra costs associated with greater employment rights. So that would be a sort of a negative view of it. I think
that's the one you hear most often, I think,
yeah.
Right? You hear in the press that actually the government's making it harder because you've made employment more expensive in two dimensions.
And I think the other view, which is, a more positive take, would be that a job is, yes, how much you get paid, but it's also, other things as well. And the government has regulated the minimum wage, pushed up the wage part of that through the minimum wage, as we've talked about. But it's regulated much less the other part. And one of the possible consequences of that has been that aspects of work in the non-wage parts have got worse. So it might be things like you push up the minimum wage, makes employers more careful about which hours they're actually paying for, so they're more likely to offer 0 hours contracts. It might be they prefer to have people as self-employed contractors rather than employees because there's no minimum wage for the self-employed. It might be that they intensify work, as we've talked about at all, causing more stress and so on. So that view would be that actually the Employment Rights Bill is sort of rebalancing things, that we've pushed up the wage part of the employment contract a lot, and now we need to do a little bit on the other bit. But that might be an argument for actually going a bit soft pedal on the minimum wage part for the moment because we're concentrating on the non-wage bit.
But think back to the evidence base. Edwin, there would have been a point in time where you might have been, one of the people having to work out the effects of some of these types of policies. How easy is it going to be, do you think, roll forward a few years for us to know the effects of minimum wage and the employment rights and how they've interacted? And
Well, it's probably easier than trying to figure out the impacts of the minimum wage over the COVID period, which is what I was trying to do. And there was just the COVID pandemic has an impact across the labour market, which is very hard to kind of disentangle. I think realistically, we might have some signs, but I wouldn't expect it to be completely open or shut, especially as we're likely not to see very big increases in the minimum wage. So in some ways, it's easier to test when you have moments like what happened in 2015, 2016, where you have this big jump and then you can test what happens. It seems like we're more moving towards a fairly slow progress with the minimum wage. And that's quite hard to test the impacts of that. Employment rights might be easier because there's bigger changes. But yeah, there's a lot going on. So disentangling it all is a challenge for good economists.
I mean, one margin I think would be interesting to see that you mentioned, Alan, is about this self-employment, that we have lots of policies now pushing in that direction. So we have minimum wages, there are the employment rights, there are the employer national insurance contributions that have risen recently. So lots of things pushing firms to, at least at the margin, prefer to contract with a self-employed worker than an employee. And we have quite high levels of self-employment in the UK. So again, I'm not sure we'll be able to disentangle them. If we can, we'll have a go at the IFS. But I think it'll be interesting to see if we do see any moves more into self-employment.
Yeah, I guess the minimum wage is definitely one factor there. I think tax typically is such a big driver in that direction, sets such clear incentives in that direction. The minimum wage is probably only a marginal push, but those two things are pointing in the same direction. So,
I mean, I think there are other parts as well. So, for example, after a certain period, you get unfair dismissal rights. Now, we have historic data on that. Period has varied between 1 year and 2 years in the past. And when we made those changes, it was very hard actually to see differences in changes in dismissal rates around those thresholds. Now we're going down, below the year that we've got experience from. But I think, those approaches are ways in which you might get some indication of whether this is, firms are getting rid of people just before they acquire these extra rights.
Yeah. I guess what'll be harder is, in some senses, do they stop people taking on them in the first place? Do you even not take the work? Do you not take the chance on the worker because you're worried about not being able to kind of undo if it's a bad match, you can't undo the decision?
Yeah, and I think you can sort of see that in debates at the moment because, people would be saying, oh, hiring is weak. And one reason people would be say one group of people saying, well, it's the employment rights bill or these other increases in labour costs. And other people saying, well, just the labour market's a bit weak. And this goes back to the, it's really difficult to disentangle what the ultimate cause of these things are.
So before we wrap up, let's talk sort of a bit of looking forward to what might happen next. So we've talked about the minimum wage going up. Edwin, remind us what's due to happen next. We have the Low Pay Commission. They've got a remit. But there's also the government wants to change the rate for 18 to 20-year-olds. So tell us what we think is going to happen. What do we know so far about what the government wants to do?
Okay, so for the adults, they've sort of 21 pluses. The remit is to not put it below 2/3 of median earnings, which is where it is now, and to take into account inflation. So basically, relative to what the previous targets, which were to try and move it up in terms of median pay, this is a kind of steady remit. So we're likely to see increases basically in line with earnings. So we're likely to see slower increases in the upcoming period for adults than we have done previously. But then the kind of radical break of this government's policy relative to previous governments is what they're doing about 18 to 20-year-olds who they want to move on to the adult minimum wage. And so in 2015, when we had this radical increases in the adult minimum wage, that was actually initially just for 25 and over, and it has gradually been brought down to 21, but was always kind of quite separate from young people. And the gap grew between the 21 pluses and young people. And now the government wants to close that and have one minimum wage for 18 and overs. There'll still be a separate one for 16 and 17-year-olds, but one minimum wage for 18s and overs.
Because there's some confusion here about what they want to do with the young adults in some sense, because it's moved to, there's always been a different rate. The gap got bigger and now it's going to be moved closer again.
Although it was different governments, so it may just be different governments have different views. So under the Conservatives, with big kind of ambitious targets for the adults and not so much for the young people, so they grew apart. And then this government have come in and they've said, we're going to bring these two things together.
But I think there's also the dynamics of the arguments for these things is kind of quite interesting. When this national living wage first came in, as Edwin said, it was initially a higher minimum wage for the over 25s. If you look at that argument for widening the age differential, it was basically that the labour market for older workers can support a higher minimum wage because the general level of earnings is higher there. It's that if you're a minimum wage worker and you're over 25, you're much more likely to be a minimum wage worker for life. And you're much more likely to have dependents. And if you think, poverty is bad, you think child poverty is worse. So those were the arguments for actually having a higher minimum wage for older workers. Then once that introduced, a lot of people started saying, well, this is terribly unfair. You've got to pay young people doing the same job as older people. They shouldn't have to be paid the same minimum wage, even though on average they're not doing the same job because we know their earnings are quite different. And so that argument, I think, began to gain quite a lot of traction. But the original arguments for having a higher minimum wage for the 25-year-olds, well, they're still there.
Still exist.
They haven't changed. So, you could see that argument reasserting itself and saying we're going to pause the minimum wage for younger workers and we're going to reintroduce this national premium.
I mean, we talked about employment effects sort of an aggregate earlier, but I mean, would you be more worried about? It seems like there are reasons to be more worried about young people because they're people who haven't yet got lots of experience. They're coming to the labour market for the first time. They might be getting entry jobs where they're still cutting their teeth. If you are going to pay an 18-year-old and a 25-year-old the same wage, then most people will prefer a 25-year-old potentially because they've already got some experience. So, I mean, Alan, are you more worried that we might see more employment effects if we start to raise the wages of 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds?
I mean, possibly. But I think, the problem here is that, it's hard to see what the total employment effect is as you drill down to smaller and smaller groups. Your data, you have less and less data on those, and it doesn't sort of get any easier. I mean, again, I think, there's a trade-off here. Yes, I think, we want young people to get some work experience and gain work experience. We think being neat is really quite a bad thing.
We should say that neat is not in employment, education, or
Yeah,
training.
sorry,
so
too.
no, it's okay. That's okay. We talked about that in other podcasts. There's about 1 million of these people now who are young adults but aren't doing something.
But at the same time, you've got to be able to demonstrate to these people that work pays. And, there's also a message, well, you're going to be doing the same job as a 25-year-old, but you're going to be paid a lot less. You can see why that sort of doesn't strike. We wouldn't like that, actually. So
horizontal equity point about...
so it wouldn't be surprising if that puts them off work, actually. They think, what's in this for me? I'm just being, exploited here. So I think it's difficult to get the balance right.
Yeah, and I think there's a question about if you think there's a case for having a higher minimum wage for older workers, what is the gap that you want? And I think that's kind of, you can accept that case and not have the world where you just keep raising the minimum for the adult, for over 21s, and just leave that gap to grow. You could imagine a policy where you said we'll keep a gap, but that gap we'll keep it at 5 or 10%, and there'll be an incentive to hire younger workers, but actually it will still stay fairly close. That could be one compromise.
I mean, just on evidence as well. I mean, how much evidence do we have about, in some sense, about what the right gradation, even if you know what you want in terms of, is there good evidence about, is 25 a magic number? Why not 24 or why not 21? I mean, how much do we know about, or is it more of your policy-based evidence making? You have to just try something and see how it works.
I think the thing is that we have a strong view that the important thresholds are 18 and 21 because those are the big birthdays that we celebrate, and you
psychological reasons.
You get the right to vote, and all sorts of other things come with that at 18. But economically, I'm not sure that those years are quite so crucial. So actually, what you see if you look at the average level of earnings, they grow very, very sharply amongst teenagers entering the labour market until the mid-late 20s. And if you're in a sort of, not a terribly skilled job, they begin to sort of plateau out really from that kind of point. So that might suggest that actually mid-latish 20s is a point at which economically is meaningful. But unfortunately, nobody is really having a massive party on their 27th birthday.
We maybe need a new milestone. Look, before we wrap up, let's do a little bit of speculation because it's also a little bit of fun about the future. I think for many people, it's been a huge economic policy, the introduction of minimum wage. I think as you said, Alan, earlier, many people probably wouldn't have predicted that it would have been increased quite as much as it has been. We now do have, one of the highest minimum wages out there. Roll forward a decade, what do you think people will be saying about the minimum wage? I mean, AI is around, nobody knows yet what that's going to do to labour markets, what it'll do to young people in particular. I mean, what's your, and I hate being asked these kind of questions, but I get to ask them now rather than answer them. I mean, if we're rolling forward 10 years, what do you think the minimum wage will look like?
That's so hard. I think we'll be sort of where we are now, sort of, with perhaps a little bit less in lower minimum wages for young workers. But I think that might take the form, as it does a bit already, of lower employer costs for young workers rather than a lower minimum wage.
Yeah, because younger workers have a discount on the employer rate of national insurance. Yeah, I think similarly we've gone through this period where we've really pushed it up. I would be surprised if in 10 years' time, that again, the big story is we've increased the minimum wage and kept increasing it. Maybe it'll go a bit further. Hopefully, you will get to a steady state where we think that we're getting the benefits from it, but we're not pushing it too far.
So not very radical predictions, but we'll keep it. But no one's saying we're going to get rid of it. And obviously, it'll depend on exactly who comes to power in the next part and all those kind of things. But.
Yeah, I mean, I think that on any scenario, they won't get rid of it, because actually, if you look at opinion polls among fairly right-wing voters, Republicans in the US, it's incredibly popular policy, because I think, those attracted to those views think there's something really wrong about a society in which, say, somebody who works hard couldn't earn enough money to support them and their families.
And actually, I mean, separately, we've been doing a big review of inequalities over recent years, and people do clearly care about their jobs and the income they get from their jobs, and feel differently about that than just benefits they get. So you can see why, even as a redistributive tool, people have some attraction to having it. Yeah, you can earn your own way in life and you can pay for things rather than getting handouts. Okay, but on that, let me say thank you to Alan and to Eduin. And to wrap up, I start by saying that it's been a huge economic policy that was introduced in 1999. The minimum wage has increased faster than prices. It now affects lots of people. So we learned that about 1 in 5, 20% of employees are earning within £1 of the minimum wage. So more people are being affected or close to being affected. We have one of the highest minimum wages in the Western world. It has, however, been a kind of a good news story in that some of the concerns about employment haven't materialised. We haven't seen big job losses as a result. So we've been able to do this kind of redistribution to some degree through minimum wages, despite pushing up quite high. As Edwin pointed out for us, it's not just about employment. There are other effects here on prices and productivity and other things that policymakers need to think about. We will all be watching what happens as the governments decide what to do with minimum wages. But so far, it's been a big, important policy. But with that, let me say thank you to you for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do share it with your friends. If you would like to support the podcast and other things that we do, you can become a member for as little as £10 a month. You can check the link in the episode description. But for now, thank you very much.